Welcome, everyone. My name is Shara Carruthers, and I want to welcome you to our Embodied Yoga Members Book Club for November and our Meet the Author session with T.S. Little. We're really excited to have this opportunity to talk with T.S. About his work and about the book. And so, as I mentioned, we've got about 90 minutes or so for the session, and we want to give you an opportunity to ask some questions. And so we've budgeted some time at the end of the session for you to ask questions. If you have questions, T.S. has put together a wonderful little presentation and talk for us actually around the concepts of the book. So if you have questions, you can feel free to drop those questions into the chat box. And then once we get to the question and answer time, we can dive into those. And obviously, as anything starts to come up, you can throw those into the chat box as well, and we will see what we can do about making sure to address those in our time today. So I want to begin with a really brief introduction of T.S., and then we'll pass it over to him to talk to us more about this book. One of the foremost yoga instructors in North America, T.S. synthesizes more than 30 years of study in classical yoga, Sanskrit, Buddhism, anatomy, trauma healing in his dynamic and original style of practice and teaching, which is influenced by the work of B.K.S. Iyengar, Ida Rolf, Moshe Feldenkrais, and also Thomas Hanna. He's a licensed massage therapist and with in-depth training in cranial sacral therapy, and he's the author of 3 books: Meditations on a Dewdrop, Yoga of the Subtle Body, which is what we're talking about today, and then his most recent book, Practice is the Path: Lessons and Reflections on the Transformative Power of Yoga. T.S. is also the co-director with his wife Surya of Pranayama Yoga, in an internationally acclaimed yoga studio located in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I'm guessing that is where we are talking to you from today. T.S., you're in Santa Fe today?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, welcome so much. We're really happy to have you with us here.
Okay, great, Chara. Thank you for the intro, and welcome those of you coming on today for a overview of the subtle body. So this book was published 2018, so it has been out now for a couple of years, and hopefully that you have it on your shelf and you're using it as a resource to date. If not, I do highly recommend it, not just because, well, I'm biased for sure. It's not only because I'm biased, but I think that for Hatha yogis, it's a really good sort of survey of the chakra system, the elements, the anatomy, the Sanskrit, some of the verses from the Gita, the Upanishads, the Yoga Sutras, they're all kind of woven together. So it's a Maha epic, and it took me a long time to put together. I'm still in recovery several years later, but I'm okay. Thanks for asking. But there's a lot packed in here. The Sanskrit itself was a real challenge to have all of the language hearkening back to the original teachings from the Pradipika, Hatha Yoga Pradipika, and the sutras, to get all the Sanskrit into place. And then there's a lot of anatomy. So it's basically this book is geared towards people who've done training work, who are yoga teachers. The Subtle Body book is not necessarily for beginners. I think my most recent book, called The Practice is the Path, this is the one that's just come out now last year by the same publisher, by the way, Shambhala Press up in Boulder. It's much more looser in format, and it's more accessible. But the Subtle Body really kind of goes right in. And so today I can just bring up some notes about what I was most interested in, and continue, of course, to be interested in the body-mind connection. So I really feel like, as I've aged through my own yogic discipline, starting really in Iyengar training a good 30 years ago, and gone on to have done a lot of work in the somatic field, not only through body work and Rolfing work and cranial work and practices through like the Feldenkrais techniques, But I really feel like the more I go on in my own practice, the more it's all about connecting to the subtle nuances of our experience, whether we're on the mat or off the mat. And so when we're on the mat, we begin to notice just the very slight pulsation of nerve, the movement of fascia, the shift of the spine, the release of the cranial base, the release of the palate, the tongue, the region around the brainstem, for instance. And so I think this is not simply a kind of New Age phenomena, but the idea in the yogic practices around sukshma sharira. Sukshma is a Sanskrit word for subtle, sukshma. So the sharira means body. So the subtle body has been of interest, I think, in Hatha Yoga. Really, it's described as having three primary components: nadi, bindu, and chakra or prana. So prana, nadi, bindu. In Tibetan, it's sa, lung, and sile, the three references in the Tibetan practices. And then the Qigong practice in China and from the Taoist teachings, similar, the notion of qi or qi. And so in that sense, when we're in the internal arts, practices of the internal arts, we're looking to really hone the subtle vibration, vibratory rhythms of the body, which are very much connected, of course, directly to Shiva, or spirit. So Shukshma is one of the names of the divine. So in that sense, when we connect to the subtle, then you're connecting to really the energy of the divine. Or I think we have that expression in English, maybe you're familiar with this, that God is in the details, or God is in the nuance of experience. And we live in a culture that, is very much hard and fast. It's the, the Humvee approach to life, big cars, big houses, the National Football League where, you plow up through the middle and you knock over the opponent and then you get to the end zone. So we live in a really fast, big, fast life. And it's hard for us to slow down. I think that a lot of the yoga industry has followed a lot of the rest of the culture with its hard and fast approach to yoga. Classes move very quickly, poses aren't held very long, there might be loud music going on, and there are mirrors in the classroom and people are comparing, how is my pose versus the fella behind me, so a lot of comparative feeling in the yoga room, and that's common, and nothing wrong with that. However, it's hard to really connect to the nuance of prana or the nerve ending, the flow through the nerve endings, and I really think that's of course where the practice lies. And just having been a meditator for many years, I started meditating on the roof of my college dorm when I was living in Massachusetts. I'm from New England originally, although I live here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in the southwestern part of the United States. Meditation was my taproot in the training. So I really like to see if we can all carry the flavor of dhyana, the flavor of meditation, or the taste of meditation through our experience. And that brings us to a more sublime awareness or subtle awareness. But we could ask ourselves more generally, like, what is the subtle body? And, of course, it was very much connected to mythos and the archetypes in the tradition of Hinduism, Buddhism. Let's see, I might have just a couple of images I could show that might be helpful. So here's a copy of the book, in case you don't have it. I was a little concerned. I spoke to my editor when they showed me a draft of the cover, and I was like, oh no, the color is not correct. You can't publish that. The color is nowhere near correct. And many people will interpret the colors as how does it go? Red, green, what is it? Orange, green, blue, RGB, what's that expression? Red, green, blue. And many times you'll see the chakras as following this sort of standard colorization, and even that is really far off. The texts actually describe in a lot of detail the colors of the chakras. It's complex, and I'm not going to go into it now, but a lot of the references, the color of a flower, like a, or a fruit, like a persimmon, or the color of a leaf, or the color of the sky, like the color of the throat chakra, the Vishuddha chakra, or the Agnya chakra in the cranium is correlate with the dawn, the color of the sky right between night and day, or the color of the crown chakra is described as the color of the moon. So anyhow, colors can't be rendered very easily. They're super subtle, and most renderings aren't correct, by the way. And there are 2 colors for each chakra. So as another point. Anyhow, that's the cover of the book, A Guide to the Physical and Energetic Anatomy of Yoga. And so let's see, when it comes to subtle body awareness, we have to have like a crystalline sensitivity for prana, whether it's the movement of prana through nerve or through the bloodstream or through fascia, or we have a very subtle awareness to what thoughts are arising in meditation. So if you're practicing sitting in vipassana, insight meditation, vipassana, we begin to notice, what thought is arising now, or what feeling is arising, or what mood is arising inside of me. And so then we become more discriminating. So viveka is the word in Sanskrit for discriminating awareness. And so really subtle body awareness leads to more discriminating awareness. And I really like this phrase from Dogo Khyentse Rinpoche, one of the great masters of Dzogchen in Tibetan Buddhism in the last century. And he wrote, "Life is fragile, like the dew hanging delicately on the grass, crystal drops that will be carried away on the first morning breeze." So in that sense, subtle body awareness connects us to impermanence. It connects us to things always changing, every breath, every pulsation, every thought, every shift in the internal winds, the vayus of the body, apana, samana, prana, udana, dhyana, any little shift in the internal winds. You're in this very alive medium that's always changing. And so when we recognize things are temporary, it yokes us directly, at least in the Buddhist teachings, to the Dharma, that nothing is static. There's nothing solid in the body. There's no solid structure. There's nothing fixed in the body. Not only that, there's nothing fixed in the mind. So the mind body has no stasis. It's like a dewdrop. It's like a raindrop. It's constantly in process of change. So when we yoke to subtle body, when we connect to the nuance, the really fine, like surface tension of the dewdrop, as the surface tension, say, in your lungs, if you're practicing pranayama, or the very fine, connection of your ear to your breath in ujjayi breath, or the sound of a mantra like om, hum, kasham, which are the 2 seed syllables in the Agnya chakra, the 3rd eye center, hum and kasham. So then, like, what's the effect if I do hum, kasham? How does it affect my cranial bones? How does it affect my temporal bone, my sphenoid? How does it affect my throat? How does it affect my vocal cords, my diaphragm, that kind of thing? So then we become really more refined, and it's all musicians, all artists, all chefs, professional dancers look for the same kind of sublime awareness in their art. I think it's not really different. So really, when you talk about subtle body, essentially we're talking about the elemental body, that really the body is described as being akin to the forces of earth and fire and wind and space and this kind of thing. And so in that way, we are made of the elements, but we're primarily fluid. So that's why I started with a dewdrop, because When we're in the subtle body, we're really in the fluid body. You know, we're primarily 80% water, at least at birth. In uterine development, 80% water. As we age, you know, we become more dehydrated. We lose our sense of fluidity. So really, yoga is the process of hydration. So here's an image in uterine development again of the nadis. So really, hatha yoga and the subtle body training is really the purification of the nadis, or attunement to the nadis. You know, and so nadis, in my estimation, in the subtle body book, Yoga of the Subtle Body, nadis are really of three types. They're blood channels, arteries and veins, and they're lymphatic ducts, lymphatic vessels, and they're nerve pathways. So nadis are blood, the pathway of blood, nerve, and lymph. And there are, you know, said to be, you know, 350,000 nadis in the body. I don't know how they figure that out. It's some, you know, little bloke in the corner sitting in Baddha Konasana with his little dhoti on, counting nadis for a couple of lifetimes. You know, they hired that poor guy to do that. And so, you know, how do they figure that out? But, you know, in the Far Eastern tradition, they're called meridian pathways, which are very much in Chinese medicine connected to the fluid body. Meridians start as gates, water gates, or bubblers, you know, springs, spring well, Jing well, it's called. The Jing well is the source of the Jing, the source of the qi as it moves into the pathway of the meridian. And so both in the nadi system, nadis are rivers, they're small rivulets. Probably better word for nadi is rivulet. So little rivulets move everywhere through the body, in the brain, spinal cord, the viscera, the fascia, through the bones. Your bones are full of nadis. There are arteries, there are veins in your bone, there are nerves inside your bone. The bones are by no means static. So then when we get into subtle body, we're connecting to the very slightest of breeze. You know, when we talk about vayu means wind. Then when we're connecting to the sukshma sharira, the subtle body, we're essentially noticing just how the wind affects us, just the slightest of breezes. So maybe, let's say if we're talking about the emotional body and you have irritation, so you notice just that slightest atmospheric pressure around irritation, or judgment, or self-blame, or unworthiness, or pride, this kind of thing, when we're talking about the 5 hindrances or the emotional body. So really, it brings us more attuned, this sensory awareness to the subtle body brings us more attuned to the mind and the heart, the emotions in the mind and the heart. So we're not simply just talking about, you know, physiological pathways of blood and lymph and nerve, but we're also talking about internal mind states, which are very much, of course, impact the subtle body, right? Very much impact the subtle body, mood and attitude and this kind of thing. So, you know, here's a photograph of a coral from the ocean. So you can see in the plants and the trees, the rivers of the earth, that the nadis are reflected in the world around us. So not only do we take care of our physical body, the health of our nadis of our physical body, but we really very much need, of course, to work more arduously for the well-being of the rivers and the streams and the waterways of the planet and the oceans today, of course. So I really love this image of the coral. So now when it comes to subtle body awareness, this is where it's at, is the conjunction of the brain and the vertebral column. So really, you know, they're classically of the 7 chakras, of which my subtle body book is definitely using the chakras as a motif or as a structure. But in the classical 7, there are only 2 chakras in the brain, right? You have the third eye center, that's the Agnya chakra, and then the Sahasrara at the top. But really, there are other really beautiful chakras. There's the Soma chakra in the brain, that's the lunar chakra. It's usually described sort of at the back of the skull. Soma chakra, there's the Vyoma chakra, that's in the space back behind your tongue, way around your uvula, the little teardrop flesh that hangs off the back of your palate. There's a chakra there called the Vyoma chakra. So there are multiple chakras inside the cranium because really the nexus of nerve in the brain is so profound. And so here we see is a really beautiful photograph of living structure that's been kind of doctored up as an illustration. You see how the brainstem passes through the cranial vault down into the spinal, becomes the spinal cord, right? So this, I don't know, I want to hear from your questions at the end and your own experience around some of this, but I always feel like yoga teachers and body workers should know structure. It's really valuable to kind of know what you're doing. And for instance, like this is the C1, this is the first cervical vertebra. So where the brainstem comes down and becomes the spinal cord is right at the level of C1. Now, many, body workers claim that if you balance C1, you balance the entire vertebral column. Most people, C1 is out of position. Most people, C1 it shears to the left, right? So that's this movement here. Of course, you're seeing me, I think, in reverse, but this is the right side of my neck. So most people are right-handed, like I'm right-handed, 75, 80% of the culture right-handed, in which case there's tension in the right upper trap and the scalenes in the SCM muscle, in which case the head gets pulled to the right, in which case C1 slides left. I don't know if that's helpful for you. And then the cranium gets pulled to the side. So now if you're doing Tadasana, you're looking to balance the spine, it's critical to do Samastiti or Tadasana to balance your first cervical vertebra right here. So that's right along the palate. See how the palate is right along the same plane as C1. And then you have at the same location, the back of the oral cavity. This is the upper part of the nasopharynx, right? The connection of the schnoz, the nasal passage right to the throat. It's a really important area right here to keep clean, right? How do yogis keep that area clean? They do neti, right? They take the salt water rinse. So I'm talking about up, back, behind your tongue, up right here where my pointer is. That is called the Vyoma chakra. Vyoma in Sanskrit means space. That's the space chakra. It's the confluence of the ear and the nose and the mouth. So if you yawn, yawning is the best way to open Vyoma chakra. I do a lot with the yawning. I never mind demonstrating the yawning when I'm in a class because it's really healthy for the brain. It resets the blood-brain barrier, reestablishes blood pressure in and around the brain. Anyhow, the important note is that we want to keep this area clear. So anyhow, no, I'm talking about physical structure, right? But the yogis correlate this with, they correlate it with the continent of South India, meaning the landmass of South India is in the subtle body awareness, in the yogic body, is correlated with the body of the earth, and in which case there are certain areas in the landform that are charged with energy, and particularly where two rivers come together. So if you have two rivers that come together, it's a sacred spot. Now, you've probably heard of the Kumbh Mela, right? So the Kumbh Mela is like the biggest gathering of yogis or Hindu devotees in the world. Every, 15 years, or is it 12, 13, I can't remember. After, over a decade, there is this confluence of yogis come together at the where the the Ganga and the Jamuna River come together. And so underneath that, there's a mystical river. It's not an actual, there's a third river, mystical river. It's called the Sarasvati River. And that, of course, relates to the spinal cord. So then you have the right side of the body and the left side of the body coming together, and the spinal cord, it being the third river, all coming together here around the upper palate region. And that's related to this spot in India where the Kumbh Mela is held. And so you get a sense for how there are multiple layers of topography when it comes to connecting to the energy of not only the body, but of the world around us. And so that particular story relates to the myth of the churning of the ocean of milk, which I begin my book, the Suble Body book, with the churning of the ocean of milk. It's a beautiful story, right? Where the gods and the demons are playing tug of war. Like there's this massive tug of war going on. And the gods take one end of the great cosmic serpent, who's called the Arishesha, and the demons take the other end and they pull. You know, it's kind of like what's happening in the United States here between the Democrats and the Republicans. It's happening worldwide in fundamentalism versus democratic institutions. There's a great tug of war going on. And so this great serpent is wrapped around the cosmic mountain, as the myth goes, the churning of the ocean of milk. The serpent's tied around the great mountains called Mount Meru. And when the gods and the demons, they're at the bottom of the ocean, when they pull, then the nectar, the amrita, it's called the great nectar, is produced out of this beginning of time, out of this cosmic pull. And so, long story, I won't do the whole myth right now, but that nectar is stolen, or it's captured, I think, by the great bird Garuda. I think my memory is correct. And then the great bird, it takes the nectar, it's kind of like in a bucket or a little pouch, and it flies over India. And then there are certain places where the nectar spills and falls to earth. And one of the places where the nectar lands is the location of the three rivers that come together, that braid together on the Indian subcontinent where the Kumbh Mela is held. So then there's another layer or another level of psychic awareness. You know, it's not just the body, it's not just the land, but then it's the cosmology of the beginning of time. So I don't know if that helps, this idea of the subtle body being perhaps both mythological. It's relating to the totem animals. All the chakras are related to totem animals. It's related to the fluid body. It's related to, you know, all the way down to fascia and bone and connective tissue and blood. So I wanted just to share a passage from Roland Becker, who is an American osteopath and a cranial sacral teacher and therapist, who wrote, "There's a slow, pervasive sense of fluid mechanism pervading throughout the total body physiology, an expansive feeling of a tidal movement coming in to fill every cell, every space, every fluid channel." So back to our dewdrop or our raindrop, back to the fluid body, back to surface tension in every cell, surface tension in every nerve, surface tension in every fascial fiber. And once you start attuning into your own states of tension, you begin to yoke to the subtle body. You begin to yoke to the subtle body. So certain practices are good for that. Meditation, as I mentioned, yoga nidra. Yoga nidra suggests, you know, this yogic sleep suggests this expansive feeling of tidal flow throughout all the channels. It's very restorative, restores the parasympathetic nervous system. It's hydrating. So if you're doing leg up the wall pose, Supta Baddha Konasana, something like that, restorative poses can impact the same, will have the same impact. Or you could do a heart-centered meditation. You could do a metta meditation, for instance, or some kind of prayer-filled meditation, which will evoke a kind of sublime feeling where the amrita, or the feeling of richness or a sublime feeling of fluid, becomes perfuse throughout your entire body. So, generally now, if we go too fast, it's hard to connect to the subtle body. And one of the chapters in my newest book, called The Practice is the Path, is called How Speed Gets Trapped in the Body. How speed gets trapped in the body. So the speed trap is ruinous to the subtle awareness, getting caught in a speed trap. And we all get, caught in rush, either because we're sending and receiving, or we are, flying from one Zoom session to the next here in the world of Zoom asana these days, or we are driving at speeds, or eating too fast, talking too fast, or moving too quickly through our asana. And so when we go at speed, we override the subtle prana. We override the subtle pulsatory rhythms of the deep part of the nervous system. We override the gut. So one of my teachers described the peristaltic movements of the gut to be like the worm body, or to move, like the ancient pulsations of the amoeba, or the worm, or the sea anemone, something that slowly opens and closes, right? So it's very easy to override the subtle body when we get caught in the speed trap. So many of us do, because we live, of course, in a culture that has such high speed connectivity today. So another emphasis of how fluid the body is, 75 or 80% water. And of course, in the subtle body training, our emphasis is to really bring awareness into the spinal shaft. So it's really the spinal shaft that houses the most profound neurological shifts. And Hatha Yoga is essentially about, gathering all the psychic energy and the physiological pulsations in the nervous system, and channeling it into what's called the Madhya Nadi. Madhya, M-A-D-H-Y-A. Madhya means middle. So the middle channel, or the Sushumna, the central channel, or what's also called the Saraswati Nadi, right? Like the myth of the three rivers, or the mention of the three rivers a moment ago. Saraswati Nadi is the central, another word for the central channel. Also called the Shunya Nadi, or the empty channel, the open channel. So so then in the subtle body awareness, we bring awareness just to the very fine movements of spinal rhythms, And so I was mentioning the correct positioning of your first neck spine as being really critical. When we collapse, the chin pops upward, or the shoulders ride upward. Very common, of course, we collapse at the base of the neck, and the brainstem narrows. The cervical region becomes impacted, and this happens a lot to people as they age. So we could say that dementia, Alzheimer's, really can stem out in part due to lack of integrity of the very delicate structures, very nuanced structures in the upper spine and the upper in the cranial region. So in that sense, the confluence of the spine and the cranium is so important. So here's another image of fluids. I was mentioning the importance of preserving the nadis of the planet. Image here of the ocean and the rivers in the Amazon basin. So let's see. And then of course, so many of the deity forms, they suggest the Sukshma Sharira. You can see in the white Tara, the mudra here of her fingers, and the super refined gesture of the fingertip, and the very delicate facial feature, and of course the portal of the third eye. And there's also a portal of the opening of the eye in the center of the palm. So it's really like the subtle body is suggestive of this very fine feature in the icons of both the Buddhist and the Hindu tradition. Very fine sculptures or rendering And this is just an analogy for, awareness, for increased awareness or enlightenment itself. So really, so much of the art of India and Tibet and throughout Asia is such a beautiful rendering of the subtle body. I'm in the process of putting together a course right now on Indian art and darshan, which it means to see, the process of seeing, and it's just so beautiful. If you study yoga, please study the art of India. You can really get a sense for this sublime prana, the refinement of prana, and awareness through many of the sculptural forms. Now, the white Tara, she's an embodiment of Avalokiteshvara, who also in the Far Eastern lands of China and Japan is Kuan Yin. Kuan Yin in China and Kannon in Japan. And so Avalokiteshvara, or the white Tara, is the embodiment of compassion. So when we connect to the subtle body, it links us to the heart. It links us to the source of metta, or kindness inside. We need this more than ever today. Kindness, generosity, patience, tolerance, right? Ahimsa, satya, steya, brahmacharya, aparigraha. Non-harming, right? Not using cruel speech or invasive speech or ruinous speech or harmful speech. So in that sense, when we connect to subtle body, then we are also coming into the heart, the region of the heart. So from the Katha Upanishad, of course, one of the greatest of all the Upanishads, in my humble estimation, I did a small course right after the pandemic started in March. The course, I think, was called Yoga and the Process of Death. That was the name of the course. And it is all about dying, the Katha Upanishad, and the vision that comes through the dying process. And so one of the passages in this text goes, smaller than the small, greater than the great, the spirit, or the Atman, rests in the heart of all creatures. So really, it's the presence of the heart, its connection to the heart that brings us into the subtle body awareness, right? So without, I think, this sensitivity of the dewdrop, the sensitivity of the very nuanced, the nuanced awareness, it's very easy for us to become hardened, cruel, critical, punitive, either self-punitive, self-punishing, self-critical, or critical towards others. And so really, can those of us who teach yoga, I think many of you listening will probably be teachers, can we invite our students to become more aware of their subtle body, because right from there, from that point, the heart, we connect to the energy of the heart. Just by feeling heartbeat, speaking of connecting to subtle body, like what are the changes in the cardiac rhythm? Can you feel changes in your cardiac rhythm throughout a practice or throughout a meditation? How does it change? Or when you're off the mat, when your heart rate increases and you get upset, you get angry, you get irritated, you get defensive. How does your heart rate change? How does your blood pressure change? So when we're aware of the nuance of subtle body, then we can really become more attuned to our own pulsations, murmurs, electrical flow inside. And so listening is all about that internal listening. And so in my book, the Yoga of the Subtle Body, in the chapter on the cranium, which is called the crown jewel, I really go into the detail around the importance of the ear and the process of listening, and using the metaphor of the conch, right? In my book, I have the conch mudra you know, the mudra of the conch. And so the inner ear connects us to the vibration of sound through the what we like to call in the subtle body the third ear. So if we have two anatomical ears on the side of our skull, then kind of like this image of the white Tara in her third eye, we could also imagine a third ear in the center of the cranium. So I just wanted to read this section from the subtle body, Yoga of the Subtle Body, listening with the third ear. In meditation, it is valuable to soften the muscular attachments around your jaw in order to release the delicate inner ear and connect to interior silence. Yoking to silence imparts a soothing effect on the entire brain while promoting shamatha, meaning profound ease and serenity throughout your entire body. This meditation serves to bring stillness and space within the skull by imagining a third ear in the center of your brain. So you could sit, if you want to, just while I read this. If you'd like to, you can close your eyes and sit with an upright spine, or you could lie on your back if you'd like to, and follow my cues that way. So sit in a comfortable position and align your skull on top of your spinal column in such a way that the back of your skull floats upward towards the ceiling and your temporal bones on the side of your skull widen. Listen to the movement of the wind within your breath as it brushes against your nostrils and throat and down into your lungs. Relax the weight of your jaw downward in order to decompress your TMJ, temporal mandibular joint. Soften all the skin around your ears. Imagine your earlobes draping downward like those of the Buddha. Soften the skin that leads into the inner ear canal. And soften down into your eardrum, called the tympanic membrane. Sense a fluid presence, a fluid equilibrium inside your ears. Balance your skull so that you feel a sense of harmony between your right and your left ear. With the feeling of serenity in your outer ears, bring your awareness inside your skull to a point midway between your two anatomical ears. Visualize a third ear at the top of your brainstem. At this point, your visualization might replicate the spiral shape of an actual ear, or you can imagine an open cavity in the middle of your skull that absorbs sound. As you listen with this third mystical ear, avoid trying to identify the sounds you hear and just listen. Sense your connection to silence. Sense your connection to space. Continue to soften your anatomical ears as you become absorbed in this imaginary third ear. And then try bringing the tip of your tongue to the roof of your mouth to widen your upper palate and soften the entry down into your windpipe. Connecting to stillness, to silence, to space. Just feel the very slightest breeze of breath coming in and out in and out. And then from here, you can relax your tongue and just gently open your eyes from there. Okay, so just a few more images in this little presentation around subtle body awareness. Another image from the Tibetan tradition of this yoking to the central channel, up through the middle, through the navel, through the heart center between the palms and the third eye center, and even above the crown of the head. So you see the totem animals. I'm not sure, I'd have to reference a little more detail this particular image, but you know, the bird of prana that I mentioned in the Yoga of the Subtle Body book is thought to dwell in the heart. So, and up into the throat, I should say, the bird of prana is in the throat. The heart actually is correlate with the deer. And so, yeah, so then you have the totem animal, and then inside the hand, I think that's supposed to be the conch there. It's a little hard to see. So the conch is the divine shell, the divine instrument of sound, and multiple heads. See their heads on either side of this figure, this enlightened figure, head on the top. So many different facets to the personality. You know, many different facets, of course, to all of each of our personality. And yet in the embodiment of wisdom, this particular class is for the organization called Embodied Yoga. So the embodied wisdom is that yoking to the sublime prana. And when it is, you know, channeled into the spine, you can see this almost like Uddiyana. See how narrow the waist is, you know, with the legs folded in, the architecture of the pose serving to bring this spacious presence into the heart. Long earlobes, I think those are meant to be earrings. That's one of the signs of an enlightened Buddha, is long earlobes. So as you lengthen out your earlobes, as I suggested in the last meditation, you can become enlightened that way, potentially. And so there you go. So such a beautiful motif with the yantra behind. And then you have the floating lotus pad. So I mentioned in the second chapter of my book, Yoga of the Subtle Body, from the section called the Sacred Sacrum. The Sacred Sacrum, how many of the enlightened figures are seated on a lotus pad. And that connects to the fluidity. You know, we've been talking about water throughout this little presentation, how the fluids of the sacrum, svadhisthana, relates to the water element, the water chakra. And so the whole body is buoyant, it's suspended, it's floating on a lotus pad. And that, of course, connects to the spinal cord, which is linked down to the tailbone. And so the lotus, the brain is thought to be the lotus flower, sahasrara, and the stalk of the lotus flower comes all the way down, connects to the Muladhara, and at least in the iconography, to the lotus pad at the base. Isn't that cool? So then you've got elements, you've got water, you've got nature, you have birds, you have, so the subtle body is this amalgam of all these different forces, of course, including the prana and the chitta awareness itself. And so lastly, BKS Iyengar in his Yoga Nidra and his Shavasana is using weight to drop down into the legs with the feet tied together to orient to the midline. We use, I always follow a lot of the Iyengar teachings using belts and props to really be able to connect to the very subtle presence of bone, the weight of bone, the movement of the organs, the very fine flow of breath, And so he wrote, the river of the body, the river of the brain, and the river of the mind are all one, flowing from the soul to the skin and back to the soul. So that's from his book, The Tree of Yoga. So in our meditations, our yoga nidra, our shavasana, we attune to the very fine presence of the life force, the anima, as Jung called it, Carl Jung called it, the anima, the life force. And okay, really great. So I think that's good there. I think I'll just stop and see now if there are questions or anything anyone would like to ask about the subtle body. I'm just happy just to share a few ideas with you today.
Tias, I definitely had a couple of questions I'd love to kind of maybe kick us off with. In the book, you talk about this idea that the body is not to be taken literally, but figuratively. And it's just a sentence in the book, and it really struck me. And as well as that, I think there's an emphasis of using metaphor and using poetry and using imagery to connect. And I wanted to get a sense from you of, when you say the body is not to be taken literally, but figuratively, what do you mean by that? And why potentially is this use of metaphor and poetry so important?
Well, I think, this is what separates yoga from physical therapy. I mean, a lot of yoga actually is becoming more therapeutic in its usage today. So you'll have, yoga in rehab centers or hospitals or trauma centers. And so then there's this sense of, yeah, the body is like, chiropractors will study, or physical therapists will study, or even the Pilates world. It's very much like, this is the structure, this is how you move it. And, having studied anatomy for 30 years, I love structure, the bones, the fascia. But then, wait a minute, there's something else that animates us. It's not just physical tissue, but there's something else that we can connect to that helps us in the soul journey. So maybe it's the totem animal, right? So maybe you have a dream of the great serpent, or you have a dream of the bird of prey, or you have a dream of the whale or the dolphin, like the movie The Whale Rider, right? So then the spirit animal becomes a source of transformation in the soul journey. Or again, it's the plants or the trees or the rivers. And so in that sense, we don't take the body literally, because that can lead to a kind of, solidifying around the body itself. So when we use the metaphorical language, as the poets do, and a lot of the texts are described with, very flowery, even the pradipika, will describe the gut as the fire, the furnace, or the throat as being the bird of prana opening its wings. And so a lot of the texts are described in poetic language. So I think it connects us to tradition, and it connects us to the dream body. It takes us away from that which is we deem to be solid and absolute. And that allows us to really move in ways that our solid body can't move. You can only move your hip joints so far in your hip opening class. But when we start really surfing into in the metaphorical realm of the animals, the trees, the plants, we can really time travel, or we can really move. So, so in that sense, I really like to teach through metaphor. Even the metaphor of the third ear. Actually, obviously, you don't have a third ear. You would think, like, who is this bozo talking about a third ear? That's ridiculous. But then when you started tuning to that, well, if there's an ear right on top of my spinal cord, and I bring my awareness to that third ear, what happens? And then suddenly you kind of step through this doorway, like, the witch in the wardrobe, you pass through a doorway, you pass through a window, you move into another realm. And so then we're really in the subtle body. And so a lot of the iconography of our tradition, the yoga and the Buddhist and the Hindu tradition is full of, it's kind of wild. It's like, what are these elephants? And, you've got an elephant god, or you've got Kali in her terrible form, and she's like horrific looking. She's got, um, she's got skulls around her neck and blood's dripping out of her mouth. I mean, like, what up with that? Why should a god appear as terrible? But that's really important, actually, to work with fear, when you work with subtle body. You're evolving on the path of yoga. At some point, you have to work with the body of fear. And it's a very important part of the path. And so, yeah, how does fear affect your subtle body? So then there'd be deity forms, for instance, that would, or wrathful forms, they're called in Tibetan teachings. The wrathful form will mirror our own fear or terror, and then we can actually work with it. So in that sense, it's not just like, oh, if I'm going to become a physical therapist, I'm studying like, the pH balance in the blood, alkaline versus acidic, or I'm measuring the angle of the glenohumeral joint and its rotation. It's like, okay, that's what the PT people do. Or, I've been studying some Pilates lately. It's like, I never hear any metaphor in that practice. It's just like, okay, this is how you do it. But then the yoga tradition is so much vast. There's just so much beautiful metaphorical language that as I age in my own practice, I try to work with and bring into my classes, because it's really invitational. It's like, when I'm not so literal, I can be more spacious.
Wow, yeah, that's lovely. I know there's definitely schools of thought and practice out there that very much tie the physical practice of yoga to the literal body. And I wonder, and you kind of touched on it a little bit there, but I wonder, how you think about that, and what you think might be missing in tying ourselves so closely to, to the literal anatomy, or the literal body.
That's a good question. Then I start to feel that my body is who I am. We become over-identified with our body. Of course, the Atman, or the Buddha nature, is not just your body. But we become, over-identified with the physical structure in that sense. And it's actually, made worse by yoga studios that have mirrors in them. I'm particularly opposed to that, because it over-identifies with the outer form. So once you start meditating, and let's just say, you're meditating on your third ear, or you want to meditate on the spirit bird, let's say, because I live here in the southwest of New Mexico in North America, and I live nearby many of the native peoples, the Pueblo peoples, the Anasazi people, and the spirit bird is just essential to their mythos. And the spirit bird represents, that which is not held to the physical form. So then, if just let's say you were bringing in the metaphor of the hawk, or the the falcon, the spirit bird, the eagle. So then that brings us, that takes us outside of our own corporeal form and links us directly to that which, supersedes or is greater than simply our body. And of course, all the texts say you're not just your body. You're everything. You're the wind. You're the trees. You're the oceans. We're each other. So how do we become less literal? And I think literal-minded types. That also leads to fundamentalism. We're having this issue in America when it comes to gun control. Like everybody. The Second Amendment is like everyone should be able to own guns. That's what it says. That's what it says in the law. But then, like, how do you interpret that? If you don't take it literally, then there's more place to move. If you take something literal, over time you're going to become like rigid. Then you go away from the fluid body. You go away from a capacity to always be changing, and we're we're facing that in the political situation here in America at the moment.
Beautiful. We do have a question. We've got a question that's coming from the group. Jessica says, I'm curious about what are some easy things to teach in a beginner class that can help connect people with their subtle body. She goes on to say, I like the heart rate suggestion because it's something people can easily grasp without much in-depth yoga knowledge. Are there any other similar ideas? She said she teaches at a gym, so she can't get too religious.
Okay. Well, yeah, you don't have to get religious to connect a subtle body, by the way. I mean, I just want to underscore that difference. I mean, you know, I think that you can be a devout, I believe in Islam or Allah, or, be a devotee of Jesus Christ or Shiva and still connect a subtle body. So it's really the beauty of this practice is not tied, to any kind of one belief system for sure. But how do you connect? Slowing down. Most people I don't know if you're in a gym, people may not relate to it. Like, what up with this? I'm just lying on my back, just, moving just a little bit left, a little bit right. I mean, I don't know if you've taken my classes before. I always begin on the back. We use very slowly. There's lots of language I use to invite people to start to what they call in Zen, turn their lantern of awareness back inside. Turn the awareness of the lantern back inside so that they start looking inward. And that's the whole process. Maybe not everyone's ready to look inward. Maybe they're more comfortable looking in the mirror or, looking at their watch and mapping their heart rate on their watch instead of, feeling blood pressure, changes in their breath. And so the main thing I think is slowing down. The main thing is slowing down. And then there's lots of invitational language I use around encouraging people to feel more. So yoga is not doing. I stopped doing yoga a long time ago. I don't do yoga. I try to be yoga. I feel it. So then if I'm doing downward dog, for instance, then I'll do it for if I can, 2 minutes, or let's say something even simpler, like do the child's pose for several minutes. And it's like, what do you feel? Like, what do you feel inside? Where does it feel tense? Where does it feel easy? Where do you feel constricted? And what state of mind comes up for you? So there's lots of ways to respond to that question, but slowing down is really important.
I love that. I love that you're talking a lot about the fluid body, about this importance of water. And at some point in your presentation, you talked about how yoga is a process of hydration. I really love that. And I wondered, or the questions that are there for me is how you talked about how over time, as we age, we tend to, dehydrate. And so yoga is this process of, I suppose, returning that vitality. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways that we consciously and subconsciously dehydrate? What are some of the things we do? What are some of the forces that are involved in that?
Well, I think one of the ways we can start dehydrating, of course, is just constraining, holding inside, whether it's holding our breath, holding our gut, holding our jaw, locking our tongue, fixing our neck, the shock response is that one. So the shoulders go up, the chin pulls down. And so when we get caught in the, what Thomas Hanna called the red light reflex, the protective gesture, then the internal structures, they tense, they harden, they become guarded or restricted. So that certainly it can contribute to dehydrating, but certainly mind states as well. So when we become, ensnared in one thought, like, oh, I'm not good enough, or, oh, I'm afraid of other people, as is happening in the pandemic now. You walk on the street and people are like, there's other people there. Oh no. And they, we go, 2 miles away from you. So there's this, hypervigilance around just being in contact with other people now. So much fear, rampant, understandably, in the time of the pandemic. So all of that constricts the subtle body. So, emotional states, fear, or being critical, or being self-denying, can all, be a means to cause dehydration. So, yeah, it's not only a state of body, it's really a state of mind. So then, what state of mind really hydrates your tissue?
Mm.
That's a good question you might consider.
And kind of continuing on from that, can you describe, or can you talk a little bit about in what ways yoga, and I think you talked about it a little bit, but in what ways yoga helps us to nourish, or helps us to return the water to our, our minds and our bodies?
Sort of practically, it's mobilizing fascia. So when we move connective tissue, fascia, we're enabling greater circulatory flow. So your blood vessels, your lymphatic channels will flow better. So, when people can move, then there's more, more circulatory ease in the body. So that I think is really important. So in the Yoga of the Subtle Body book, I really suggest that the chakras are all about fluid, right? Because if there are lotuses, all along the spine, the chakras are like waterborne flowers. Then the process of yoga, to use that analogy, that metaphor, obviously there's not literally lotuses along your spine, but that means that the nerve bundle, called the ganglion in the anatomical sense, the ganglion or the nerve bundles, they're also hydrated. They're not constricted, and so fear or rage or dread. If I think there's a lot of nihilism or dread on the planet today, it can all confine the lotus petals. They start wilting down. And so, it's good to note in your own body where you wilt, where you tend to constrict the most. Is it your belly? Is it your throat? It's oftentimes the region of the jaw, back behind, the uvula that I was pointing to before. Most people have temporal mandibular joint constriction, super common. So yeah, in that sense, we allow our lotuses to float.
I know that not all yoga is created equal, and so the question that comes from me in hearing that is are there ways of practicing yoga that aren't nourishing? And I mean, I kind of have a sense of the answer, but I'd love to hear from you about, because I'm guessing that there's practices of yoga or styles of practice or ways of practice relative to the individual that are actually more depleting potentially than nourishing. And I wonder if you can touch on that or talk a little bit about that.
I think so. I think that, I've been in systems myself. I did a lot of power yoga because as a young male in my 20s, I was eager and I thought, well, this is about just getting as far as I can. So I was comparative, I was competitive, I was in a very power-based practice that was, basically it was like the more you do, the better you are. And now I look back and see how much of a fallacy that was. So yeah, I was actually, I think a lot of the, rigorous, like really rigorous yoga can be self-punitive. It's kind of like, running a marathon. It's like, well, I'm not going to make progress unless I wring myself out. And so I think maybe that pattern is already set up inside of us to be self-punitive. And so we perpetuate in the yoga room. And the Buddha, carefully cautioned against that. I mean, it later on became identified as right effort. So how do we learn how to practice right effort? That's one of the chapters in my new book, The Practice is the Path. So, it's a good 20-year project to find out for you what's right effort. Some of us push too much, some of us are too slack. We do the sloth asana, we're just too slack. So really we want to find right effort. But I think, yeah, some practices aren't that nourishing because we're kind of pummeling ourselves thinking I should be better. I'm not as good as the person next to me. I'll never be that good. I'll never have that body. I can't be a yoga teacher. I don't have the body like, that she does. So there's all that comparative. And that really can be corrosive on the subtle body, corrosive on the prana, those mindsets. And so for me, it was quite profound, when I was able to sort of let go of myself as a sort of compare, at least in my body, like comparing, my practice to others. I haven't done that for a long time, but I did in the yoga room. I think a lot of us do. And then that sets up this dynamic. It's like, I need to be better, or I'm not good enough. And that affects the heart, gut, brainstem, so it's a good question.
I've got lots more. I've got lots more. Does anyone else have any other questions? Because I've got lots more that I could ask. If you do, go ahead and put those in the chat. In the book, the book begins with the feet, and you even talk about how the feet are like a chakra themselves. And we have this, we have this traditional sense of the chakras, starting from the root chakra, moving all the way up. And you talk about the importance of moving from the ground up. And so can you talk a little bit about that, about why that's important? And yeah.
Yeah, so, well, in some ways, the chakras are all the way down into the legs. I mean, it's limited to think that the chakras are just in the spine, So the chakras are in the femur, the chakras in the knees for sure. Your knees are like a chakra. How are your chakra knees doing, by the way, as we age, especially those of us former athletes? Like I was a soccer player for many years. I have to really take care of my knees. So, a chakra also means to spin or to move. So it's like, how do your ankles move? So your ankle, chakras in your ankles, chakras in the soles of your feet. Many of the icons, the images of the deities, they show the lotus on the feet. And then even down below the ground, down below us, there are chakras. So that's why I start the book with Jung's, Jung gave a series of lectures in Vienna in the 1930s on Kundalini yoga. Carl Jung was quite into mandala and the iconography of India, and the Kundalini system. He actually did a whole expose on the chakras. And anyway, he talks about, down below the earth is really the source of the deepest vitality. And in my book, I referenced the Native American belief to be very similar. So yeah, so how do we connect down below our body? And so then we say, in the yoga practices, that we begin with the feet because we're bipedal. It's really important to open the gates of the feet. The foot arches, there are 3 arches in the foot, the inner, outer, and transverse arches. So when we lift the arches of the feet, we're beginning to move energy up through the legs, up into the pelvis. And so you can't really open your sacrum. You can't really work with your perineum or your lower gut without support from your feet. So when the feet, are collapsed, the lower spine might collapse. And so then, so then in the book, I basically do all kinds of, cool, what I find to be really interesting, really interesting polarities between the heels of the feet and the heels of the pelvis, meaning the sitting bones and the heels of the skull, the occipital condyles. So it's in the, well, we have 3 sets of heels, or you know, you have your sacrum is definitely connected to the back of your skull. So what's the polarity between the skull and the sacrum? You know, how is your tongue connected to your, related to the tensions around your lower belly or your pelvic floor? Those are very powerful, that polarity between tongue and perineum. And it goes on from there. It's like the pelvic floor and the crown of the head, or there's a polarity there. So many ways to look at the way the body is mirror, you know, all the structures in the body mirror each other. But generally we begin with Tadasana. If you study, you know, Iyengar yoga, you study, you know, it begins with standing position, and then we do triangle, half moon, warrior 1, warrior 2, you know, all the standing poses to begin to wake up the feet, to wake up the spine. So yeah, the book, the Yoga of the Subtle Body book, is all organized around the feet opening from the ground up.
I love that, and I love the languaging that you use as well, just to tie everything together. One of the ideas within the book that feels like it's an idea that that is definitely pervasive out in the yoga world is this idea of, I think about it as like the microcosm of the macrocosm. I think in the book you say things like as above, so below, and things like that. And it's this idea that we can take some understanding of ourselves from looking outside of ourselves in the natural world and seeing what's there, and then tuning into, you know, the elements are an idea about this too. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about if there's anything that we can perhaps better understand about the outside world by looking inside. We're in this moment right now that's so turbulent, and I do wonder, is there something we can learn from inside that we can use or we can apply to our experience of the world around us?
Well, that's a good question. Well, you know, of course, we just had an election here in the United States, and you know, it oftentimes comes up in yoga circles. Well, you know, should a yoga teacher be political, make any kind of political statement? And I say, well, of course, we're part of what's called the body politic. In the medieval language, you know, it's like the people are connected. You know, in the initial Roman organization of the land-based governing system, is the people are connected, of course, to the land and connected to the governing. And so in that sense, you know, we are one body politic. And that was really so cool in the US, in that we voted Democratic, we voted in the right direction, and that, that there is a means by which we see I'm not limited to my body, but I'm part of a greater body. And I think over time we are be less myopic, hopefully. Yoga practice goes this way. We're less myopic. It's not just about me. How slender can I get? How fit can I get? You know, my trim buns, my core lift, my Uddiyana, my handstand, my, you know, 3rd series of Ashtanga yoga. It's not just about me. It's really not about that. It's like, how do I see myself as being interdependent, or what Thich Nhat Hanh called interbeing? So I'm part of this interbeing, like Chief Seattle, you know, from the Northwest, one of the great leaders, the Native American tribes, you know, said that you know, the man did not weave the fabric of life, and he or she is not separate from it. We are just a strand within the fabric. So over time we see, wow, wait a minute, I'm just like a strand in the midst of this really big fabric, and that's cool. And then you know, I'm in service of the entire weave. So, you know, when I started yoga, it was basically, you know, it was about self-improvement. It's like, how far can I get? You know, how many poses can I do? And it was like a big self-improvement project, which I think for a lot of people it is. And then over time, you see, that the microcosm of my body is, you can't separate it from the macrocosm. And the more we all realize that today, maybe, we can put the brakes on global warming and, the overuse of our resources, and we can work more towards the well-being across generations, across racial divides. We can bring more justice and support for communities of all kinds. So really, I think it just came to my mind, of course, when we voted, that we're part of this body politic. And yeah, you have to get involved, you have to vote. So that's a good question.
Yeah, I hear you. I definitely hear you. This book, I agree with you that this book is, it's definitely it's a powerful book, and it's definitely a book that I think all yoga teachers should have. And even if you're an advanced practitioner and you want to dive a little bit deeper, I wonder, just in terms of talking about the process of the book after, this book came out in 2018 or so, and that sounds like you had a lot of years of study and practice before all of that. And I wonder, what brought about the writing of the book? What was the impetus for this after so long? And were there questions? I know in the process of writing books, we learn so much. And so I wonder, were there questions that this book answered for you in writing it?
Let's see. Yeah, it was really kind of a culmination of my studies. I mean, I'm a very interdisciplinary guy. I've drawn a lot from osteopathic medicine, a lot from craniosacral work, a lot from Ida Rolf's work, for instance. And then, I weave in, elements from Qigong or the Taoist teachings, as well as, India, teachings from India and Tibet. So, I'm very interdisciplinary, not just like one guru, this is one system, one form. I like to be interdisciplinary that way. So many threads that I pulled onto this spool. And I think when it comes to, my own learning process, it was a real challenge to kind of bring the metaphoric or the imaginary body, what's called the Sambhogakaya in the Buddhist teachings, or the dream body. How do you bring in all that imaginary realm into the structural realm? Because I'm also a real structural guy. Your temporal bone connecting to your mandible, connecting to your larynx and your subdiaphragmatic space. So it's like how to bring those worlds together. That was the challenge of this book, and it was not easy to do, to weave them. But even as a yoga teacher, I try to do that walk because I think it really addresses the right and left side of the brain. So it's a little too simple to say. We know that in contemporary neurology, it's not really this way, not so binary, but let's just say if the left brain is more your structural side and your right brain is more your imaginary side, we want to create that weave. And so I always try to bring poetic language, sort of mystical language, abstract language, and tie it into, well, this is your femur, you're feeling, this is your SI joint, this is your quadratus lumborum muscle. And so I find that weave very rich, very special, and it's endless, it's boundless. So in some ways the book is it's kind of like 3 books in one, the Subtle Body book. And I'm just happy that, most people, I think will keep it on their shelf for a long time. It's not the kind of book you just kind of flip through and then are done with, because there's so much in there, the mythology, the meditations, the trauma work, the anatomy, the Sanskrit, the Vayus, so in some ways it's like probably too much. uh, but I birthed it. You know, it took me a while to get it out of the birth canal. That wasn't easy to birth this baby, but I hope people will have it on their shelf for quite some time.
Mm. And so finally, just as we wrap up, because I know we're getting to the end of this, one last thing is in writing the book and putting it out there, was there something that you were looking to inspire in people, in students, in teachers, you know, something that some fire that you were looking to light?
Well, let's see. I think it's just an encouragement for people to really ride the edge of, and knowing that any edge is a great edge, right? You don't have to do this extreme edge of like the Hanumanasana, the splits, or some, you know, wild handstand. Whatever edge that you're on now in your body and mind is a beautiful edge. It's a rich edge. It's an edge that that deserves to be explored. And that's the nuance, that's the subtle body awareness. And the more we start to just notice our whatever edge we might be on, the more we start opening up these multidimensional awareness. And so I guess the book is really is an invitation, you know, to connect to the nuance of experience. And I think there's a lot of beauty in that. There's a lot of beauty, there's a lot of richness, there's a lot of appreciation, like, oh, wow, I really appreciate just being able to feel this subtle pulsation inside of myself. And I also have respect for the anima, the force that gives to all life. You know, I vow to protect the creepy crawlies and the fish and the four-leggeds and the birds and the trees. It's like, wow, prana is really subtle. It's really amazing. It's really powerful. It's really beautiful. So then the vow is to cherish it, to love it unconditionally, and to be supportive. Its own sustaining, enduring presence. And we need that on the planet today as, you know, the oceans get depleted and the elephant population and the rhinos get diminished and the tigers, et cetera, et cetera. So it's so, you know, prana and the life force is so incredible. And when you attune to it, you know, you get your high fidelity tuner out there and you're listening to pulse and breath and just the little edge, whatever that edge is for you today, it opens you to a whole universe or a whole Buddhaverse of awareness.
Fantastic. Wow. Well, Tias, I just want to say thank you. I suppose on behalf of Embodied Yoga and the yoga teachers, I do just want to say thank you so much to you for all of your work, for your practice, for opening your mind and your body and your heart to put into this beautiful book. I've got it just here with me, and for sharing it in this time with us today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Chara. Great questions. Thanks for keeping it alive, and well-being to all of you. And may all of our good work be in support of the interbeing of all. So thanks for joining.
Yep. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.